Thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here talking with you. I am supposed to talk about the economics of education in Africa, but that is a very difficult topic to talk about. I'm going to try to talk about that without using numbers. It's tough to talk about economics without numbers. So we're going to use our imagination. A lot more. But first, I'm not sure who is here today, so I'm going to start. Okay, so I disconnect this one. Okay. So if the MC may permit me, I would stand on the protocol that was established yesterday. If that is okay for time, I'm not sure who is here and who is not here. Going first. So a little bit about my background. My grandfather was actually a teacher. My mother is a teacher. But unfortunately, I wasn't a very good student. And that is putting it mildly. I was one of those students you dread to have in your class, right? I was more of a tyrant than a student. So I spent a lot of my early adulthood being apologetic of my behavior to teachers. And so in that vein, I would have started today's discussion by apologizing, at least to educators and those who educate educators. But as luck would have it, my career trajectory took me on a path that led me to teaching MBA students. So I feel I have paid my debt to society 50 times over. So I will not be apologizing today. That was supposed to be funny. Actually, if I had told the joke in Pidgin, you would all have been really laughing. Pidgin is the lingua franca in West Africa. If I had told this joke in Bambili, my mother tongue, everybody would have been rolling on the floor with laughter. But unfortunately, I have to tell the joke in English. And when I speak in English or tell jokes in English, I lose my creativity. It's not as funny, right? And we're stuck with this, and we wonder why. Today I have to talk to you about the economics of education in Africa, and I have to do so in English. Maybe, as I was discussing this with Professor Demano, we talked a little, maybe it should have been about the diseconomics of education. It could very well have been about the economics of miseducation. Or we could have gone with a double negative and think about the diseconomics of miseducation in Africa, right? But I think I would settle on the Afrinomics of education. And with Afrinomics, we would think a little bit about a demand curve that is somewhat upward sloping, and we can't find the supply curve yet, right? Maybe by the end of the talk, we'll figure out what an African supply curve looks like. But just understand that as I'm talking in English, I will do so without my normal jocularity, humor, or creativity that would otherwise have been found if I were speaking to you in Pidgin or in Bambili. But why do we have to incur such a cost? I mean, can you put a number to that creativity, the humor you're losing by me not expressing myself in my most creative way? Sub-Saharan Africa is actually the only place in the world where all the children have to learn in a language other than their mother tongue. Research has shown upwards of 30% drop in learning effectiveness when using a foreign language as opposed to your native tongue. Once again, let's think about that for a second. Everywhere across sub-Saharan Africa, all the children are being taught in a secondary or sometimes even tertiary language. What is the cause of this inefficiency? Once again, we're not going to do any math. We're just going to use our imagination and think about it. It gets more expensive the higher you go up the education ladder. I have some friends, for example, who studied medicine in Germany. So they go beyond their mother tongue, they go beyond Pidgin, they go beyond English, in some cases French, and they're studying biology, medicine, complicated science in German. That's 4 languages removed. What discoveries would they have made in medicine? What lives would they have saved? How good would they have been if they studied medicine in their native languages? Think about all the benefits that are being lost if we could quantify these lost discoveries. The economics of education in Africa necessitates that we actually begin this discussion along the lines of what could have been. I know sometimes it is difficult for us to conceive what we never had and to put a number to it, but we don't have to put a number, we just have to imagine what could have been across the continent in terms of discoveries, in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity. Everywhere else in the world, in Germany, in Japan, the students study in Japan, researchers research in Japanese, they write their articles in Japanese, then it gets translated into other languages. Articles in other languages get translated into Japanese. So they sleep, they dream in Japanese, their creativity is in Japanese, and they do their research in Japanese. I think about all the discoveries that Africa would have had. I think Einstein would definitely have been bested if Africans learned, taught, and wrote in African languages. In fact, most of us here know Africans already knew time is not linear. Time definitely is not linear in Africa. Africans know very well about relativity of time, right? We didn't need to be Einsteins to come up with a theory of relativity, but we certainly would have bested it. Many economists would sit and calculate the opportunity cost of using a foreign language. Afrinomics would tell us that is futile because it is impossible, it is incalculable. We cannot begin to imagine what it could have been. We can, however, begin to discuss what could be. As educators looking to transform education, we can revisit the question of language. While it is not possible for every single African locality to change and start using their own languages, there are some languages that enough people speak across the continent that can start pioneering this. I mean, we think about Kiswahili, we think about Hausa, we think about Yoruba, we think about Akan. And well, we're right here. Why not add Fanti to the mix, right? That means probably unemployment for some of us, but it means that those who replace us will be more creative and more productive. And that becomes the definition of progress. We cannot think about the losses that come about language or talk about language without also understanding the broader issues of education structure. Right? Language itself is a product of colonialism, but so is our education structure. We're in Cape Coast, and you cannot be in Cape Coast without realizing we're a stone throw away from a Wellesian secondary school. I think today it's called Fan City, and I may have been pronouncing that, which is, I believe, the first elementary school in West Africa. Across the bay is Fruawa College, the first also in West Africa. And we all know what drove those institutions of learning. They reflect every single institution of learning across Africa, right? Colonial education in Africa was undertaken by 3 separate entities for their own purposes. These included the missionaries, the merchants, and the colonial governments. When missionaries sought to educate Africans, their main purpose was to have, when missionaries sought to educate Africans, like with the Wellesian school, the main purpose was to have Africans who could help during worship, mass servants, for example. The missionaries saw education as a useful training to spread the gospel. They were educated to become catechists and messengers. Like missionaries, traders also provided education, but the education was designed to produce Africans who could help the merchants with basic bookkeeping and nothing more. Colonial governments saw advantage in educating a small section of the population, particularly sons of chiefs. They liked, especially the British, who preferred indirect rule, to use in what we call administering the colonies. It was generally not uncommon across West Africa for the British to pick the sons of the most callous chiefs to be the ones to educate, to use as their instrument for indirect rule. Post-colonialization, how much of that structure has changed? How much of Fruawa College, or even going back to my alma mater, which I'll talk about later, which was also Cameroon Protestant College, a missionary school from colonial times. Same buildings, same structure, same, not the same curriculum exactly, but the same principles of education. Principles that were meant to educate, not necessarily educate, principles that were meant to train Africans to follow orders, obey authority, take instructions. It was not meant to teach anybody to be inventive or innovative. Definitely not raise questions, not challenge authority or change conventions, or do anything today that we would otherwise consider leads to creativity or innovation. Yet none of these have been reformed post-colonialization. Those are still the same structures we build up. Is it surprising, therefore, that we produce scholars here in Africa, economists, who will stand and tell us a new colonial currency like the franc CFA, that itself is modern-day slavery, is good for us? Are we surprised that we produce educated politicians who would go across and negotiate trade treaties with Japan and China that are worse than ransom payments, as if their mothers were held hostage? There are these structures. We have to rethink the foundation of our education system, because this is where the economics comes into play. Now, I did promise some friends that I will not talk about burning down anything. But the English language is kind of difficult when you're thinking about how to bring down a structure and rebuild it. I grew up in the Savannah Highlands of the Bamenda Plateau, and at the end of the dry season, the only way you get any new growth of grass or foliage, you have to clear the old growth. Otherwise, nothing new will grow, right? And the most effective way to clear the old foliage is to burn it, control burning, right? So sometimes the analogy of burning, of fire, is rebirth, not necessarily destruction. But I will not talk about burning anything. Maybe we use transformation. But in any case, we have to think about how we dismantle a system down below its foundations, because the foundation itself was not built to serve Africans or African children. There was education in Africa before colonialization. And Africa has had a good history of education, maybe not formal education, right? It took Hillary Clinton to fly over Africa to teach us all in Africa. It took a village to raise a child. Up till today, I'm not sure she or many of the others who repeat it actually understands what it means. One of my brothers actually introduced me to the writings of a Loa philosopher, Okut Bitek, and who I found really has best articulated this. And he did this in juxtaposing African way of life versus the Western way of life. And he said, from the West, the civilization, there is some sort of a level of hypocrisy in a civilization that dissociates itself from core elements of the civilization. For example, in the West, your culture is different from the civilization. You put your culture in the museum, you put it in theaters. Only the rich and privileged can go to the museum, can go to the theaters and experience it. You put your religion in a building called church, and you go there on Sundays. It is dissociated from your daily life. If it's Sunday and you are in church, then you can be religious. You put your education in school, separate from your home. When your children are there and there is a teacher there, they are taught. And that in his view is a very big hypocrisy of a civilization, because those are the three central elements of a civilization, and to be civilized you have to live them. And that is how Africa was different. You lived spirituality. There was not a special day for religion. Your spirituality was your daily life. It wasn't a Monday or a Tuesday. It was how you live on every single day. Your culture, there is not a specific place where you go to dance. What time of day? When you're happy, you dance. If it's in your bedroom, you dance. If it's in the play yard, you dance. If somebody's playing a drum, if there's no drum, if it's beating a bottle, you dance. It's your culture. You live your culture in your daily life. But the same was also true for education. Education was part and parcel of the culture. It was a daily activity. Yes, it took more than one person and it took a village, but it took a village because it was not separate from life. It was part of life, and aspects in which children had to be educated in was inbuilt into every single activity you did in life. And so as we think about transforming education in Africa, I would recommend and plead that we think about going back to African roots. I don't know how, but education in Africa cannot work if education in Africa is not based on African cultures and African principles. Education in Africa cannot work, cannot be efficient if education in Africa does not start with the African child and African children and the mind of the African children and the society of the African child as its basic principles, as its foundation. I know we're going to run into opposition, most people here, when they go back home, because most of our governments prepared to spend money on guns, weapons, than on schools or on infrastructure for education. But when we talk about education, it may help us to spend some time talking rather about the cost of miseducation. Because when people tell us that education is too expensive, true, nothing is cheap. But miseducation, ignorance, is usually way more expensive. The alternative is never cheaper, right? And I'll use this opportunity to recall the story of one Moses Selachi, a Tanzanian who actually worked in a rural area in Tanzania, Kigwe. He worked in the Kigwe Royal Hospital. Mr. Selachi was the in this hospital, actually, let me come back, they faced a simple problem. It turns out that every other Sunday, the people on the north side of the ICU ward died. Everybody on the north side, the beds on the ICU died. They did all sorts, they consulted the Marabout, he couldn't figure out anything. The doctors there, they did all sorts of studies, tested for pathogens, swapped the beds, everything, nothing happened. They couldn't figure it out. Until they brought in a consultant who said, but I'm going to stay there for a month and see what happens. And sure enough, he's there 1 week, nothing happens. Second week, nothing happens. He's getting frustrated. On Sunday, Mr. Feleshi comes in. He's a part-time consultant, he's backup, so he comes in every other weekend. And he does Ward 1 on Saturday. On Sunday, he does Ward 2. And he's a very diligent worker, and he comes in and he dutifully unplugs the machines and plugs in his vacuum cleaner, and he vacuums the ward. And he goes. When he's done, an hour later, he plugs back the machines on the right side, and he goes. So even if your life's aspirations are to be the part-time backup cleaner for a royal hospital, lack of education can be very costly, not only in monetary terms, but in lives. And that is where education matters at the most fundamental level. But we also have the problem when we still think about the economics of what happens to our educated. Because in Africa and most of our societies, we think education is just about the certificate, but nobody actually is that certificate. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I probably wasn't the best student. And long after I had graduated, I became the president of our alumni association in the United States, and I visited my alma mater back home. The principal then, who happened to have been the chaplain when I was a student, was quite happy to see me, and we sat in his office talking, and he told me, Herman, you know, there is a problem. I cannot control this school. All the children are indisciplined, and unlike your time when you were indisciplined and I called your father and he'll come and join me to discipline you, and by the way, he did that a lot. Today, I call the children's fathers and they come and they join the children to insult me. I said, really, why is that? He said, pièce détachée. I said, what do you mean pièce détachée? And my French was very bad, so they had to explain to me. The people who speak French know, so they are laughing. He said, use parts from Japan. I said, what does that have to do with anything? He says, everybody in town has gone to Japan and they're buying used parts and they're millionaires. And so they are the people who have children in school and they don't understand education, so they join their children and insult me. And I was really troubled. One, I was happy. I told him, serves you right. But on the second note, though, I was quite troubled because it raised a point that we don't think about. Why is it that there has to be a trade-off, especially in the African middle class? Why should there be a trade-off? Notice the implication of that. And I actually did see it. My alma mater was no longer admitting the children of professionals. My parents were professionals, civil servants. My mother, as I said, was a teacher. I could no longer afford to send their children there because the new middle class, the traders, were the new middle class, and they were the people who could afford to send their children there. Why should there be a trade-off in the middle class between educated professionals and traders? Out of curiosity here, how many of us based in Africa can afford an iPhone? And you don't have to raise your hand physically, you can raise your hand mentally. Think about that for a second. In many of our societies, a security officer who goes to high school and gets 6 months of training earns 2 or 3 times more than the university professor. Does anybody live in that country? Anybody here lives in that country? Or any of such countries? That's common across Africa. They'll earn twice more than a doctor. So what are we saying as a society is the value of education. I have had the privilege of traveling around the world, and many people know I am an African, and of course, everybody wants to do business in Africa, and I get asked a lot, well, how should we do? And in fact, Professor Demano happened to have sat with me while I was answering or consulting on one of those. So as I was in Ghana, I was actually talking with a smartphone and smartwatch manufacturer who was interested in coming to Ghana. And I would share this insight which I've shared with many companies. They had some nifty apps and some nifty features of smart devices for the house. But here's the problem I was pointing out. This is great. The people who can afford it will not know how to use it. The people who know how to use it will not afford it. Unlike the rest of the world, when you go to Europe, unlike the rest of the developing world, you go to South America, you go to Asia, the rising middle class is made up of the educated professionals, the teachers, the professors, the lawyers, the doctors. Who makes up the rising middle class in Africa? The corrupt politicians.
Yes.
The traders. When we think about economic development, when we think about the digital economy, we're talking about AI, all the things you're supposed to do to prepare for the next generation. How many of them can spearhead, utilize, or be in any way a driver of that? How many of them can lead, invest, or place themselves for tech ventures? What about the consumer economy? How will that work? Even in terms of the things we think about implementing as education professionals, right? I was laughing when we're talking about how to use GPT and all that, and I'm thinking, okay, who is going to buy the laptop for all the professors? Or who seriously, right? Or who is going to give them the phones? Because once again, our countries, unfortunately, do not prioritize that. And that is unfortunately the diseconomics of education in Africa. I don't know that we know any solutions, or I know any solutions to that. Probably most of us here see this every day. But it's a problem that we have to contend with, because unless people see the rewards of education, and education is necessary, education is valuable, but unless as a society we value it, it becomes very difficult for it to lead to progress, for the next generation to value it. Right? So how many children today sit and think about the path forward to life is in getting a good education, a career, and doing something progressive in society, discovering some technology or some invention, versus pulling Yahoo or wherever the pull scams these days. I think Yahoo is badly old. Right? But I don't want us to end on a more depressing note. But let us think about where there is lots of potential when we think about the economics of education in Africa. But before we go, I promise no numbers or statistics, but I'll throw this out there. it is across Africa, but I'll use Ghana numbers since we're in Ghana. So, according to Ghana Registered Nurses and Midwives Association, for the first 8 months of last year, so by August 2022, 3,000 nurses had left Ghana for the West. That is just by August alone. Ghana is not the worst case, but Ghana is reaching red levels such that the United Kingdom government has advised hospitals in the UK, last month advised hospitals in the UK, that please don't hire nurses from Ghana. We're in Cape Coast. What happens if 30 nurses leave Cape Coast a month? It's really good for the nurses. They get to feed their families, they get to upgrade their standards of living, and it's good. But who here would want to have a heart attack while we're here if across this year, 300 nurses, the top 300 nurses in Cape Coast have left? Nobody. All of us sitting here, we wouldn't want to have a medical emergency while we're here. But the people of Cape Coast deserve medical treatment. The people of Cape Coast bore the cost of training those nurses. But we can't also lock down the nurses, just as you can't lock me down if my country doesn't value the fact that I'm educated and they decide to pay a security officer 3 or 4 times more than they pay me because, well, I have to feed my family also. There is a demographic shift in the world that is very significant. Africa is the continent with the youngest population worldwide. As of the end of last year, 40% of Africa's population was aged 15 and younger, compared to a global average of 25. For comparison, for Europe, it is 14%. For North America, it is 20%. Most of the West, and that includes Japan and China also, are aging. When you have that situation, you're facing a continuous labor shortage. And that starts becoming apparent in certain areas. Medical, especially taking care of the older. But then Africa's greatest resource all of a sudden becomes its people. Do we as educators solve that problem by just educating more nurses and doctors to go to Europe? Is that taking us back 400 years? Maybe this time voluntarily? I mean, I don't know. Last month, I was at an event in New York and a gentleman from who does this in Kenya, he approached. I was with a Kenyan who the gentleman was asking to intercede on his behalf. And he had taken this year, he had taken 150 nurses from 2 hospitals in Nairobi. And the hospitals had seriously lobbied and he had been banned from coming in. They had tried to stop him from coming in. And so he was lobbying to see if they could intercede on his behalf. And so all of us were concerned today at President and said, well, but okay, we understand the right of the nurses to leave, but when you go to a hospital and you take 150 nurses to hospitals in a city, what exactly do you think is happening to that hospital? What have you thought about giving back? Have you maybe thought about opening a nursing school? Maybe if you opened a nursing school and trained 500 nurses in Nairobi, people would not be as upset if you took 100 and left 400 behind. But that is imperialist thinking. That is me thinking, making money. Africans have to think about what their solution is. Otherwise, you would not like the solution somebody else would think. Right? For example, when I came in yesterday, the young ladies at the lobby they said, oh, they just looked at me and said, oh, Pa, go and sit down inside. We'll bring your things to you. When I came in this morning, they looked at me and said, are you a student? I have been smiling ever since. There's something, right? There's something must be going on in Cape Town. I've definitely looked a lot younger since I got here yesterday, such that between yesterday and today now, I'm looking like a student. I don't know what I'll look like if I stay another week. So, but I mean, I throw that out there. Once again, Africa is the youngest population. The world is going to come for Africa's population. Whether we like it or not, the world is aging. There are no two ways around it. I mean, I had the discussion with my pastor that I've been looking to look. I said, the only two ways to increase your population is immigration and more birth rate. The birth rate has a 20-year lag. And by the way, if half of your population is over 60, I'm not sure that increasing birth rate is working quickly anytime soon. So, once again, the economics tells us that Africa is going to become the labor force of the world. Now, as educators and as we think to transform our education, is it going to be on our terms? Why I talk about why I say that is, I'm thinking, maybe you can bring the hospitals to Cape Coast. Most of the fragile, the ill, the elderly who need the nursing could do a lot with Cape Coast Air. I mean, look at what it has done to me for one day. You could market that. If you're in Cape Coast, you could market that. Right then, the nurses may not have to leave. That's one, I was just a bit, I don't know what others are. But we as educators have to be proactive. I think we have to think, as we think about transforming the system, to think about doing it on Africa's terms. On terms that suit Africa, that are within the context of Africa, that are within African culture, that are within African principles. Terms that our children, African children, feel comfortable in, can think in, can be creative in, can be at home in. I was telling one of my colleagues that I did not know the difference until after 30 years abroad, I came back to Africa and I came to a conference in Africa. And yes, it is a different me. I'm a lot freer. I actually talk without checking myself. I actually don't think about my accent. I actually don't have to worry that I'll mistakenly slip in a pidgin word or a word from my native tongue. I actually don't worry about how I laugh. It makes a difference. And we should do that for our children as educators. And so, if we don't do that, somebody else will, because the change is coming. The question is, who decides the terms? Thank you very much.
Thank you.